words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. In the name of Jesus we pray, and all God's people say. Amen. As we leave behind 2019, both as a congregation but also as individuals, and as we move into and we look into and we sort of maybe anticipate some things that are going to happen in 2020, I thought I would take a look at what I've called, and I've used this over the past this Sunday for this purpose, is sort of the verse of the year. And I know some of you have actually kept this verse of the year, maybe put it up on your fridge, and it's been sort of a theme verse for you over the year. And in the past, we've really adopted a number of really good verses. The first one is Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. Let's say this together. I know for some this is a key one. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Wonderful verse. How about Jeremiah 29, verse 11? I know this is also a part of our mission team's focus as well, too. But this is another one that I know some of you hold on to as well. Let's say it together. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future. And last year we used and we took a look at the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. And it's just a very simple one, but really a powerful one. Let's say it together. I can do all things through Him who gives me strength. Amen. Amen. This year I thought we would go back and we would take a look at the Old Testament. And the verse that I've chosen, or maybe even for you to sort of consider, is Deuteronomy 31, verse 8. And it goes like this. It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. Now, I want to begin by taking a look at what we understand as 2020 vision. 2020 vision is a term that is used to express normal clarity or the sharpness of vision. And I had to learn a little bit of even why we call it 2020 vision. The way, and we have a resident doctor in the building here with regards to what it is and what is this Snellen chart that's before you, and that we're very familiar with. But the idea behind 2020 vision is that if you can stand 20 feet away, okay, and then you see the numbers on there, 2020, and if you can read that particular line. Now, I'm not saying this is accurate, Caroline. I know it's not accurate. But if you go to a doctor's office, they will ask you, and you will read this chart, and it will determine what your vision is like. 2020 vision, and the 2020 is right there, beginning with the D, and E and F, and moving on along those lines as we go down. Right? Now in Canada, also something that I learned is that that's more of an American version now. 2020 vision. In Canada, it's what? It's 6 meters, right? If you can see that particular line around 6 meters, then you have a pretty good clarity of vision. As Jason was saying to the children, we also use 2020 vision in another way. We talk about having hindsight as 2020. And it really does mean that when we look back at certain events in our lives, circumstances that took place, maybe in the distant past, maybe even in the more recent past, we can see how things unfolded. We can come to understand maybe some of the decisions that we made that led to a particular event or maybe a particular relationship. We can also see some of the choices that maybe we wish we hadn't have made. But we also come to that point where we know, and as we look back, we have a clarity of exactly what took place in our lives. Some joyful, some, in a sense, enlightening moments, and moments in which we saw clearly even a little bit more about who we are. Also difficult moments, challenging moments, moments where we struggled with doubt, maybe even wrestled with grief. Maybe we were uncertain about what our future was going to hold. Maybe it was losing a job and trying to go down that path. All different kinds of scenarios as we look back on our lives, and maybe particularly for you in 2019. But hindsight is 2020. And often the idea behind that metaphor, that analogy, is that when we look back, we have a clarity of maybe our own lives. And sometimes, even as we stand in the present, we understand how we got to this point in our decision-making processes and the choices that we made. Well, I want to suggest to you that perhaps in some way, this is what the context of Moses' message, this line, this verse that we read this morning was in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, I know, and some of you would say to me, Ian, Deuteronomy is not my go-to book in the Bible. and I can understand that, because it's if you start reading it, it's really basically made up of 3 speeches or 3 sermons that last almost 34 chapters. Moses wanted to pack it all in there before he actually turned over the leadership to Joshua. But Deuteronomy is the last book of the Bible, the last book of the Torah, or the law, or sometimes what is known as the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then comes Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, in fact, the word Deuteronomy means second law. Or in some ways, it can maybe take a look at it in a very simplistic way. It's the second time that Moses actually repeats the law, gives the Israelites something from God's word with regards to the Decalogue, and even more commandments that they are to follow and to obey. It is also in the context of, as Israel looks back, as Moses is looking back, they're also looking forward. They're on the threshold of crossing the Jordan into the land of Canaan. And in many ways, Moses finds it important to remind the people of Israel who they are, where they have come from, and indeed who has brought them to this place. And so, in many ways, Deuteronomy is really a book of hindsight, 2020, reminding the people of Israel, this is who you serve. This is who has brought you to this place. This is the God who has brought us out from the land of Egypt and has delivered us. And now we are on the verge of the promised land. Maybe one of the most well-known verses of Deuteronomy is this. In fact, Jesus referred to Deuteronomy a number of times in his teaching. And we'll recognize this as well, too. Let's say together, this is from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 5 and 6. It says this: "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart." Why was this such a big deal? Why did Moses find it necessary to stop, just even before they were going to move over into the promised land? Why did he find it necessary to stop and to look back and to remind the people of who they were and whose they were? In fact, we know also too, and some of you might remember this too, even in the Passover meal, there was a sense of recite this to your children, recite it to your grandchildren, remind them of who they are and where they have come from and the place that they are. And so for Moses, it was important to keep these words and to keep things in this perspective. It was God who had brought them out of Egypt. It was God who had promised land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was God who would bless them as a people and as a nation. In fact, not only bless Israel, but bless all nations, right? All nations through them. And so it was God who gave them, and in a sense gave even Moses these words, but gave them this place and this law such that they could live in relationship with God. And so Deuteronomy in many ways is hindsight 2020. It's Moses looking back and saying, you know that circumstances that we were traveling through, coming out of Egypt, who did that for us? As we were wandering through the wilderness and we had nothing to eat, who was the one who provided the things that we needed? As we were even in the throes of enemies threatening to take us over, who was the one who protected us? And so Moses gives these words to the people to remind them that sometimes even despite, and we all have been there, despite even some of their poor choices, maybe even their disobedience, their worshiping of the golden calf, their stubbornness to believe. Remember, there's this sort of wonderful metaphor that's used. These people are such stiff-necked people, right? But God didn't give up on them. God did not abandon them. And as Moses looks back, he says, this is what we need to remember. God had been merciful. God had been faithful. God had delivered them. God had kept his promise. And even more so, would do this going forward into the future. Amen? Yeah. You know, sometimes I think we need to be reminded of this as well. I know I do. Sometimes we look on an event in our past life, maybe even something that happened this past year. And maybe at that moment we didn't really experience God's presence. We didn't experience God's peace. We were wondering, maybe, where, God, are you in all of this? And maybe sometimes, too, even for some, we become tempted to even let go of our faith. God, I believe you exist, but wow, I'm really struggling with this right now. We're like that man who comes to Jesus saying, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And we've had moments like that maybe even in 2019. And maybe we even struggled, and maybe we've had some really difficult and terrible circumstances. There's been moments when we have been afraid. Maybe there's been moments when we have doubted, moments when we have been anxious. And the question at that point has been, has God forsaken us? Has God failed us? Will God go before us? And sometimes to see our past is to realize ways in which maybe we've experienced God's faithfulness and goodness in ways that we would never even have known unless we'd actually gone through that circumstance. Amen? Yeah. And as we look back, we can also look forward and we can see it also with the eyes of faith. This past year, I was thinking about this in my own life and reflecting on this sort of theme of hindsight as being 2020. And I know in my own life, as I was thinking about this, sometimes we're called to love others in ways that it takes us out of our comfort zone. And we need to sort of stop our schedules, and we need to listen, and we need to act, and we need to come alongside of others in love. And sometimes that can be a difficult thing to do. Sometimes we need to not only simply care for ourselves, but also we need to stop and we know what it is to care for others, because sometimes they're having a real hard time caring for themselves. And there's a part of it too where we know we're called into that circumstance, but there's a part of us also saying, why me, God, in this? And are you going to be present in this? Am I going to know your peace in this? Now, not to get too personal, but looking back into 2019, and particularly in the fall, I was standing in Canadian Customs with my sister. And she was transitioning from from the U.S. to Canada. She'd been going through some challenging times. And I knew before that, God had just said, Ian, you need to focus in on her. You need to take some time out and you need to love her and help her and care for her. And there was a part of me saying, but God, I have all these other things that I need to do. But then I also realized, too, that God had his promises, not just for me, but also for somebody like my sister. And when I was standing there in Canadian Customs, and if you've ever been there, I remember this was my first experience when you're moving from the U.S. to Canada. It's really no country at all, is it? It's sort of between places in transition. And in a sense, it's a physical place, but we've all been in that place of transition, of moving from one place to another. We wonder, what is going to take place? What's going to happen here in these circumstances? Do we have all the right paperwork? Is everything that is needed to be done? And it was even at that moment when I realized that prayers were being answered. That God was present in that place. And it was really a smooth transition. I sort of had to chuckle. There was some folks who were coming from the Bills game on that Sunday afternoon. And the Canada Customs seemed to be a little bit more concerned about the amount of money that they spent on their jerseys at the Bills game than they had with regards to some of the things that my sister needed to do in order to make her transition. The things we worry about, the things we get anxious about, and the things that sometimes God calls us to care about. And as I look back on that, as I said, hindsight is 20/20, and maybe you've had a similar experience where in some way God has answered a prayer. Maybe not the way that you expected, but God has answered a prayer. God's presence has been there, maybe in the form of another person, maybe in terms of an encouraging word, maybe in terms of somebody who's coming alongside of you, as you maybe even come alongside of them. And so in the wilderness, Moses gives this speech, he gives this sermon, as the people of Israel have been wandering between Mount Sinai and the Dead Sea, and now we're on the border of crossing the Jordan River into the Promised Land. Moses knows also, too, that his mantle is going to be given to somebody else, a Joshua, a new leader. And there will be those who will be anxious about that as well, too. What are we going to do without Moses? And this is where Moses steps up and he says this: it is the Lord who goes before you. It is he who will be with you. God will be with you. God will not forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. And sometimes looking into the past allows Moses to look into the future with what I'm calling a 2020 faith. A 2020 faith. God had been there in the past, and God would be there in the present and into the future. And Moses is convinced that God can do it again. And this is what he reminds the people of Israel. I know that there's times when we read the Old Testament, particularly this part of Deuteronomy as it moves into the book of Joshua. And there are those who have said to me, well, Pastor Ian, wow, this is a really interesting part of the books of the Bible, because what we find is that God says, I'm going to go before you and I'm going to allow you to cross. You're going to cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And there are those who inhabit that land, but I'm going to give you that land. And there are those who said to me, well, Pastor Ian, why does God, allow that to take place? Why is that there? And there's a part of it, too, where I believe that God also goes before us even when we sometimes, and here's the metaphor, even when there are things that will oppose us in the future as well.
And the metaphor even of moving from Deuteronomy to Joshua, the metaphor of crossing the Jordan River into the promised land, is something where God promises his people, yes, that land is full of giants. That land is full of those who are going to oppose you. But I still will go before you. And you will be able to take possession of the land that I have promised to you of old. For me, it's also a metaphor, and it does this as well, too. I see this even in the life of Jesus. It's interesting, too, that the story that was read to us about blind Bartimaeus takes place just outside of Jericho, right? That was the first city that Joshua led the people of Israel after that promise that he's going to lead them. Well, if Jesus comes into Jericho, and what does he do? What does he do? He opens the eyes of a blind man, Bartimaeus. Jesus is the one, he says, who comes to set the prisoner free. He's the one who's come to proclaim the good news to the poor. He's the one who's also going to one day return as our judge and our Savior, as Lion and the Lamb. And we will be given a promised land. Not just as we will be given a new heaven and a new earth. And then all will see the salvation of our God. In other words, what I am saying here too, as Moses said that Yahweh God would lead and would go before the people of Israel, so in many ways that becomes who Jesus is for us. Jesus leads us into the future. He goes before us. Now you'll say to me, well, in the meantime, Pastor, what does that mean for my life? In this time of transition from the past into the present and now into the future, who do we trust? Who is my assurance? Who is it that I can know, that I can trust? I know that sometimes it seems as if in moments the world is out of control. And really no one knows sometimes the economic and the political stability of our times. Who goes before us? Maybe sometimes we're anxious about what the future holds for us personally. Maybe there's things that we wrestle with. Maybe we struggle even with faith itself because of some of the evidence in our own lives. And God, as I said earlier, God, do you exist? Do you care? Are you part of even my own life? God, do you go before me? Jesus, do you go before me? Sometimes we know that there are fearful enemies that we need to face. To use that metaphor, that language. And you know what those enemies maybe might be in your own life. God, do you go before me? Jesus, do you go before me? Hindsight, we say, is 20/20, but then so too, here's my thought for us today. So is faith. Faith can be 20/20 as well too. And this is what Moses is getting at here, is that indeed it is the Lord who goes before you. We might not be able to see. We might not even be able to know. We can anticipate, but we don't necessarily know for certain, but we know this. This is what we do know, that God has gone before us. Amen? Christ has gone before us. I said at the beginning of this message that the Deuteronomy was a series of 3 very long sermons or speeches that Moses gave. But the very last part of Deuteronomy is in fact a song of rejoicing. I don't always think about Moses singing, but there's a song that's attributed to Moses as he as he rejoices. He knows that he is not going to be able to lead the people into the promised land. That is for someone else to do. But as he looks back on his life and on the way that God has guided the people to this point, he breaks out in song. Moses rejoices in the Lord because the Lord has ultimately been behind him and his leadership, behind the course of their history. He believes and he sings out that God is in control and he will accomplish his purpose for his people. He will continue to deliver the faithful and be righteous. He will restore prosperity for his people. He will not forsake them. And perhaps this is for us today. Perhaps I want to suggest to you today that this is the 2020 faith that we can hold on to for ourselves as we move into a new year. Even as we look at our schedules for 2020, we know that there are things that are coming up. There are things that maybe we're rejoicing in, and they're going to be good, happy times, great times. We also have those parts of our calendar that are circled where we are going to be anxious. There are moments in which we are going to wonder, God, are you going before me here? And the promise is this: I go before you. We see it promised in the Old Testament. We see it even in the life of Jesus. And by his Spirit, we are reminded that God is with us. So here is maybe a verse for you for 2020, with a 2020 faith. Let's say it for ourselves together. It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. One more time. I'm going to ask you to change the you to me. It is the Lord who goes before me. He will be with me. He will not fail me or forsake me. Do not fear or be dismayed. Amen? Amen. Let's pray. God, we thank you for your word to us, and we thank you that by your Spirit you can continue to speak to our hearts even from an ancient text. God, we thank you that it is your word to us. Maybe it is your word to somebody here this morning who is looking into 2020. Maybe they are struggling with faith. Maybe they are struggling with your existence. Maybe they are struggling with your presence in their life. God, I pray that these words would take root in their heart and that they would know that you are a God who goes before them. And that you are a God who goes before me. So God, we thank you for that assurance. We thank you for that confidence and that assurance. And we come and rejoice, as Moses does right at the end of that book. We rejoice greatly. We come with joy because we want to adore you. And as we see our lives unfold before us, we are reminded and we see threads of your presence in various ways. God, keep our eyes open to that. Keep them open to your presence. Keep them open to your grace. And I pray for those here today that as we move into 2020, that indeed we would hold on to this promise that you go before us. In the name of Christ we pray. And all God's people say,